10, 9, ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
Welcome to part 11 of our video series highlighting the 1/100th scale Saturn V kit from Estes. In this installment, we'll be masking and painting the iconic roll pattern onto the model, along with some other assorted detail bits. While it is possible to do this with spray cans, we'll be using a simple single action airbrush to apply the roll patterns, and along the way we'll discuss some of the reasons why that approach is far superior to using rattle cans. Let's review what we'll need for this process. In addition to the upper and lower airframe assemblies, we'll need an airbrush and a compressor. Now, I recommend a quality single action airbrush for most modelers. A single action airbrush is one that has separate independent controls for both airflow and paint flow and has a much less steep learning curve than the alternative, which is called a double action or a dual action airbrush. A double action airbrush combines the paint and airflow into a single control, and it's great for those doing fine art. They're also ideal for modelers doing complex paint schemes like those you might find on World War II Luftwaffe aircraft. If that's your jam, good luck to you. Here's a selection of single action airbrushes I've used over the years, and a couple of these would be a good choice for this project. This first one is a Pache Model H airbrush. I've probably had it for more than 30 years. It's what's called an external mix airbrush. In other words, the paint and the air are mixed outside of the body of the airbrush. It's very reliable, it's very inexpensive to purchase, and it's also very simple to maintain. The downside is that the mixing of the air and the paint is not quite as fine as it is on other airbrushes. It would still be great for this project though. This is what we'll be using. This is a Model SI airbrush from Pache, and it's called an internal mix model. That means that it mixes the air and the paint within the body of the airbrush, and it gets a little more complete mixing of the two elements and a finer pattern on the model. This final airbrush is a Tamiya fine detail airbrush. It's great for very small areas and very small amounts of paint. That's why we won't be using it on this particular project. We're painting much larger areas than this particular brush would be appropriate for. Now, I caution against using cheap airbrushes like the no-name or obscure brands that you might find at Harbor Freight or on Amazon. The problem here is not necessarily functionality, but parts availability. The cheap brands are simply disposable. Fortunately, a good single action brush like our Pache tops out at $75 to $100, and they will last forever, and you'll always be able to get parts. We'll also need a simple compressor, and a critical element here is to use a pressure regulator and a moisture trap, especially in high humidity areas. Surprisingly, a cheap compressor is often as good as an expensive one, although the inexpensive choice is likely to be louder. This is a situation where the cheapie from Harbor Freight is just fine. When airbrushing, I use acrylic paints exclusively. They're consistent, they cover great, they clean up easy, and they've got a huge choice of colors. Predictably, I like the Tamiya products. There are other brands that are just as good, like Mission Models, Gunza, Vallejo, and others. Whatever brand you use though, I strongly encourage you to use the thinner made specifically for that brand. We'll be using the thinner Tamiya offers for their acrylic line. Now, can you use enamel or lacquer paints through an airbrush? Absolutely, the results will be fantastic, although the cleanup becomes more complex and you'll need a proper paint booth and mask because of the more volatile solvents. With acrylics, the solvents are alcohol and water-based and can be sprayed inside without stinking up the house or giving your dog cancer. We are going to use a bunch of masking tape on this project. For application directly onto the surface of the model, we're going to use Tamiya tape, which is available in 6, 10, and 18 millimeter widths. Now, because the Tamiya tape is relatively expensive, we'll use cheap 3M masking tape for attaching overspray masks to the pricey stuff. For overspray masks, I like to use standard plastic grocery bags. I view this as a pretty noble form of recycling. We're giving the grocery bags their equivalent of a Viking funeral. For loading our paint and thinner into the color cup, we'll be using these disposable plastic pipettes. You can get a pack of 6 of these from your local hobby shop for $5, or you can get a bag of 100 from Amazon for about $6. Cleanup with the acrylics is easy, and we'll be demoing our favorite way to do that. The process is much easier if you've got one of these nifty little cleaning pots handy. I picked mine up on eBay for about $20, but I've seen the same thing at Harbor Freight for less than $5. For years, I used a simple stadium cup with a few paper towels crumpled up inside. It works almost as well. I use generic window cleaner and Q-tips for cleaning. We're going to go through a lot of Q-tips. This is a set of templates that's included with the kit to help guide masking. The big one will be installed on the lower airframe over the large wrap that connects the first stage, interstage, and second stage. This curved one here will be used on the transition interstage between the second stage and third stage. And finally, this small one will be used on the base of the fin fairings. Let's go ahead and cut them out. And with that, we've got all the windows cut out of this template. One of the nice things about this template is there is really only one way it will fit onto the model. And with that, all of our templates have been cut out. We're going to start out with the big template on the big wrap. We aren't going to try and mask and paint everything all at once. Instead, we're going to break the job up into smaller, quicker bits and then paint small areas individually. Generally speaking, all of the circumferential elements, in other words, those that go around the model, will be masked and painted first, and then we'll go back and add the vertical elements one at a time. Now, one of the cool things about this approach is that we'll inevitably learn from each little bit, and we can apply what we learn on the next section. It also means that any potential mayhem will be confined to one small area and not all over the assembly. We'll start with the top part of the roll pattern here in the interstage area and mask around the airframe. Let's begin by putting our masking template into place. The top edge of the mask defines the bottom edge of this black stripe. But where's the top edge? According to the directions, it's 9/16 of an inch forward of the top of the mask. That puts it just above the corrugation, which is an easy thing to mask. We'll start putting that tape into place now. I'm using small pieces of tape, and then I'm using a food skewer to push them down into place when we get to obstacles. This is a lengthy bit of footage here, and I considered editing it down quite a bit. Ultimately, I decided that showing this particular technique for applying the tape was pretty important, especially the use of the wooden skewer to push the tape down into the surface features. That little trick will become especially important when we move down the airframe to the corrugations. Note also that my magnification visor peeks into the frame from time to time. All of the circumferential bits on this upper line are now masked. We can now work on the bottom line. I'm going to define the top edge of the bottom line. Yes, that is a mouthful. A few places around the tube, and then take the masking template off. Okay, let's take the masking template off of the model now. And the next thing we'll do is mask up to those lines. There is a different challenge here though, because we're not masking on a flat surface, we're masking over these corrugations. That's where our skewer becomes absolutely critical. I'm using the tip of the skewer, both ends actually, to work the tape down into the corrugations. Keep in mind that the tape doesn't stretch well at all. I'm not pushing the tape onto the surface of the model until it's been worked down into each individual corrugation. I'm simply laying it loosely on the surface of the model until we can go to work with the skewer tool. Now that this section is done, I'll pull our guide strip up. That's roughly 1/8 of the circumference of the tube done. We'll continue the rest of the way around the tube. As we go through this bit of footage, note that the micrometer is being used to check spacing several times. Also, note that I'm rarely trying to mask over the detail elements like cable raceways and ullage motors. That's because they tend to distort the tape and spoil the straight lines. We'll go back and mask those separately in a little bit. With that, all the circumferential elements are masked. We need to go back in now and mask off all these conduits, cable raceways, and fill lines. For these longitudinal details, I'm masking each side separately. I find that it's a lot simpler than trying to get a perfect fit with a single piece of tape. One side gets masked, the excess is trimmed away, then the model is turned around and the other side is masked. It's much better for one's mental health to take that approach. All the basic masking for this stripe is in place. We're going to add a little bit more tape to attach our overspray masks to. Because this tape touches the surface of the model, we're using Tamiya tape. We'll bring in our inexpensive tape and attach the overspray masks to that. And with that, the masking for this stripe is in place. Before we paint, I'm going to go burnish each of these corrugations down one more time. All of the corrugations have been burnished down one final time, and we can go ahead and prep our airbrush. Let's go over another reason why we really want to use an airbrush here. Although the quality of the spray paint is fantastic and will work here, The paint comes out of this can at somewhere between 60 and 80 pounds per square inch. On the other hand, the paint is coming out of this airbrush at about 14 pounds per square inch. What that means in real consequences to us is that the likelihood of paint migrating under a tape line is much, much higher if we use the spray can. On top of that, the solvents in the lacquers have a tendency all of their own to migrate regardless of pressure. That doesn't happen with the airbrush. It goes on, to use an inaccurate term, a little bit drier. Let's go over what we're going to need again real quick. We'll need paint, of course. I'm using Tamiya NATO Black Acrylic. We'll also need thinner. I'm using the Tamiya Acrylic Thinner. I'll need a pipette to transfer the paint and thinner. I've got Q-tips for cleanup later, and off screen I have a bottle of Windex and the cleaning pot for my airbrush. We're going to prep our airbrush. I've drawn about a half a milliliter of thinner into the pipette. I'll put that into the cup. I'm going to place an equivalent amount of paint into the cup. I'm now going to use the pipette to draw that up into the pipette to mix it. I'll draw it in and out a few times. And then we can throw away the pipette. We'll test the flow on a piece of paper. Way too much. That's about what I want. I want it very light. We're going to lay down lots of light layers. Don't try to do this all at once. We never want the paint to get wet on the surface of the model. Also note that I'm spraying perpendicular to the surface of the model. Okay, that should do it. We'll clean our airbrush now. To clean the airbrush, we're going to start by spraying out any excess paint in the cup. To do that, I just open up the brush and spray until the level drops inside the cup. Then, I take my Windex, or generic Windex in this case, put a few squirts into the cup and spray that through. Windex in the cup again. This time I use a Q-tip to scrub down the sides of the walls of the cup. See, there's still a fair amount of paint in there. I like to back the needle forward and back a few times. Cup is empty again. A couple more shots. We'll use the other end of that Q-tip. It should stay blue this time. And it does. Then I like to take that clean Q-tip and scrub out the tip of the brush. Just for grins, we'll pull the needle out. It's still pretty dirty. We can moisten a paper towel with some Windex. There are all sorts of nicks and crannies inside an airbrush. Put our needle back in. A little bit more Windex. And that should do it. We're ready for the next time. Our paint's had some time to settle down, so let's go ahead and start removing the masking materials. Okay, at this point we need to be really careful removing the masking materials. And there we go. That stripe, simple as it is, looks fantastic. Again, this is the most complex masking job we'll encounter on this project. Everything from here on will be relatively simple. We have our masking guide back on the model, and now we're going to put some guide tapes in so that we can define where the tape needs to go for this first roll section area, what I call a quad. I'll take some 10mm tape and put the tape on the inside of where we want these lines to go. This will be a little trickier here. We're just going to follow the corrugation up to this point. Let's take the masking guide off. On this side, I'm going to use a piece of 18mm tape. We're going to follow the top of that corrugation. There are a few details we'll need to go over. On this side, I'm going to use 10mm tape. Why? Because it's not my first rodeo. I'm going to turn the model around now and mask this side of this ullage motor. Now we're going to go to some 6mm tape. Back to the 10mm tape, and we'll mask the side of this conduit. The bottom edge of this quad is defined by the bottom of the wrap. We'll mask carefully right over the edge of the black we painted previously. Next, we can put an overspray mask in place. We've now got an overspray mask in place. I'm just double checking the edges to make sure that nothing gets through. Put a little more tape right there. And that looks good. Let's prep the airbrush. Our first layer is going on very, very light. Again, I'm spraying perpendicular to the surface of the model. Just like with our rattle cans earlier, I'm finishing off the surface we're painting. Let's increase the flow a bit. We'll increase the flow one more time. That looks fantastic. We'll let that paint settle down for a few minutes and then unmask it. We'll gently pull the overspray mask off. And then start removing the masking tape. We have the tiniest bit of overspray down in this area. Fortunately, that'll be easy to clean up. The upper roll pattern is complete and all 4 quads are done. Now I found a mistake after I took the masking tape off, and that is that the extensions of the cable raceways that go into the roll pattern area shouldn't have been masked off, so I need to paint those black. I've already masked those off. And there's also a small area where I had a bit of overspray right here. I need to correct that as well. It won't take long to do this at all. I'll put some overspray masks in place and begin painting. With our paint repairs done, the model went back out to the paint shed off camera so that the upper section could be sprayed with clear gloss lacquer. That's because the acrylic paint is a bit on the fragile side, and the gloss lacquer puts a protective layer on top of that. That section is then covered with an overspray mask, and we can turn our attention to the roll pattern on the lower airframe and fairings. Here on the lower airframe, each quad will be painted half black and half white, with the black being applied from the center line of each fairing over to a point midway between the fairings. Fortunately, there are plenty of details to guide us, and there are also a minimum of sand traps and water hazards in our way. It'll be much easier to mask this than it was to mask the midsection. To continue our golf analogy, this one is a par 4. We'll be painting black from the base of the fairings all the way up to the bottom of this intertank wrap. Now we'll be using some 2.5mm masking tape to mask off this narrow ledge at the bottom of the intertank wrap. Once this is in place, we can back it up with some wider tape. Note that I'm using the back end of an X-Acto knife holder to push the yellow tape down onto the surface of the red tape. With the intertank mask now in place, we can start masking the lines from between the fairings up to that point. There is a detail on the model that makes this relatively simple to do. We'll pull one of our skewer tools out from earlier. The next thing we'll do is mask off this fin. We'll do that 3 more times. The fins are all masked. Now I'm going to begin putting in this mask line right here. On the fairing, it's very easy to get. You go from the tip of the fin to the tip of the fairing. You then carry that line forward to a point on the interstage wrap. Now the easiest way I've found to project that line forward is to use a ruler. If I just project that line forward, we'll get a straight line. I'm going to break this up into small pieces. I'll begin with the section on the fairing using 10mm tape. Then we can go straight up the corrugation. We'll install another bit of tape at the aft end of the fairing. Again, we've got a corrugation here to help guide us. I'll repeat that 3 more times around the airframe. We've completed masking all the way around the lower portion of our airframe, and we're almost ready to paint. I've also put a overspray mask in on this upper section. Note that I used the good Tamiya tape everywhere the tape contacts the model, and the cheap painter's tape to attach the overspray mask. I'll go over everything one more time to make sure that all of our edges are sealed down, and then we'll begin painting. We're using Tamiya NATO Black again, but given the large volume of paint in use, we've added a special ingredient called a retarder. A retarder is something that you mix in to slow the drying process of the paint. We're not worried about how quickly the paint dries on the model, but rather how quickly it dries in the color cup and on the tip of the airbrush. The particular product we're using is called Liquitex Slow Dry Blending Medium, and you can find it at any arts and crafts store. Just a couple of drops is all we need, mixed in with the paint and thinner in the color cup. Note that I'm trying to keep the airbrush pointed perpendicularly at the surface of the model to reduce the possibility of any masking errors. We've given our paint some time to settle down, so let's go ahead and begin removing the masking materials. Here's a good tip for removing masking tape. When you remove masking tape, don't pull it straight up. Pull it back against itself. Okay, that turned out pretty darn good. There's one minor masking error right there that I'll be able to fix with a paintbrush. Now our next step, after this settles down for a few days, will be to mask off the lower skirts of the fairings and the fins and to paint those silver. In addition to those silver elements, we'll also be painting the roll pattern onto the tapered transition section, as well as tackling the detail painting on the third stage. Thanks for watching.